I am for discipline. I am for clarity.
I have invented the word la ville radieuse, which cannot be translated in English.
He's usually quoted nearly everything that I've said, and not quite the way I said it.
Thank you, Fergus. Thank you very much for the kind invitation and for hospitality. Fergus asked me to talk about, maybe give a little bit of a personal angle on it. So without going into too much, putting myself too much into the foreground, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I and we got to the point we got to. I'm going to talk about Astley Castle. That's the other ruin of the title. But I'm not going to frame it in terms of heritage or history. I really want to talk about it in economic and social terms. Perhaps that's a bit of a big ask, but bear with me. I'm going to talk a bit about the untamed forces that shape my city, London, and I think some fairly sustained encounters with European architectural culture. And I suppose then, in that framing, Astley is the project where we kind of sublimated the kind of aspirations and frustrations into architecture. Right. So I'm going to start with, by complaining about London, the kind of reality, our daily reality. And I'm going to use Joseph Schumpeter's famous idea of creative destruction as a kind of thread for linking, talking about the city, and talking about working with the ruins of a castle. And when he wrote about creative destruction, the Schumpeter, the Viennese economist, was really talking about the effect of recessions in the economy, in the economic landscape, kind of clearing away for like these older firms, making space for new, hungrier companies, almost like sort of, as he frames it, this sort of necessary renewal of the institutional and economic structure of economies. Now, depending how you spin it, you could say, you know, this is what London does, or you know, or is it? There's a lot of creation, there's a lot of destruction, but you know, what's driving it? Is it perhaps something more parasitical? This is some of the most expensive real estate in London. A row of villas that have lain abandoned for about a quarter of a century up in Hampstead. Yet they still, I think there's a couple of them on the market now, they still offer a spectacular return on the initial investment because it's the land that's valuable. The bricks and mortar, the stucco, whatever, that sits on it is of much more marginal interest. So, at the moment in London, we're demolishing 1,200 apartments for social housing and replacing them with double that number of apartments, only 79 of which are for social rent. This is the Haygate estate in South London. And to rub salt in the wounds, there's a pop-up mall of shipping containers which will occupy part of the vacant site over the early years. So if you like, there's this restless energy, this hunger eating up the city, giving buildings that are fundamentally durable a very short life. And because the value of the land always trumps the value of the construction on it, there's a sort of thriving trade in hypothetical constructions What developers say is that every building is a failed development deal, because what they'd really prefer to do is buy a bit of land, get consent for a bit more than has already been consented, flip it on, and they've turned a profit. So of course the kind of the moment they dread is that kind of pass the parcel moment where it actually falls on them to have to build out a scheme that has all these sort of the fantasy of the market, but not necessarily the kind of economic basis to happen. So, London, you could sort of zone large areas of London. It's this sort of opportunistic model where there's no rules. You work in France or in Spain, they give you the gabarit, this sort of theoretical volume, or the plot ratio, what you can put there. Here it's whatever you can kind of blag, whatever you can persuade. And the mayor actually issued, there was a whole set of extremely thorough, whole kind of project of densification of London in the name of sustainability and sociability. Issued a whole set of density guidelines, and it turned out, when they reviewed it about 5 years later, that the mayor was consenting something like 70% of schemes above his own density guidelines. And the density guidelines are pretty dense, I'll tell you. So it's a city where we spent £9 billion erasing industry from the city edge to create the Olympic site, making something that kind of sits uneasily between tabula rasa and a kind of museum of infrastructure. This is the Channel Tunnel rail link, a whole set of Victorian railways, canals, rivers, and where the public sector has imposed these kind of rigid rules on what can be built on its own land. It's sort of fantastic aspiration of family housing and low density, or not hyperdensity, at the same time across the red line boundary, which in some cases actually abuts the park. It's the Wild East. It's, build whatever you can, fill your boots. It's a city where average housing prices are £400,000 and the average salary is a tenth of that. And in short, it's a place where for maybe 80 years there was a progressive project to remake the city. Pretty flawed, the whole kind of garden city movement, but it started off as an attack on value, an attack on monopoly, initiated by Ebenezer Howard. He was an anarchist. He wasn't a sort of planner or anything like that, but he was an anarchist. He wanted to kind of break the monopoly value of London land value and its kind of iniquitous hold on, or all its sort of side effects. There isn't a progressive project anymore. I guess the one that was there has been deemed to fail. But since then, there isn't really any progressive urban politics and very little scope for progressive practice. So which takes us back to almost this sort of Victorian theme of London as a force of nature. This is actually Pasolini's description of Rome, but it's, it chimes. The contradictions are existential. It's this sort of magma, this chaos that this is Cruikshank's caricature from the 1820s of London going out of time. These brickworks spewing bricks out into and chasing the haystacks away. So this, like I say, this force of nature, unstoppable. Of course, it's the sort of same theme, but now we just have a much greater destructive force. And, the Grim Reaper of economic change is waiting to cut down the most durable building. And this is the world that our kind of conservative Viennese economists imagined. It's competitive to a fault. And actually, strangely enough, this is the world that was taking shape as I grew up. in the sense that we spent my childhood following the decline of British industry with my dad's work as a factory inspector, taking us from shipbuilding in Newcastle to textile in Leeds to printing in London, each on the edge of this kind of abrupt decline. I mean, it's not something I noticed at the time, and I'm not sure that he'd noticed, but that's what we see now. That's the landscape we're dealing with. And it's not the world that our educators, the people who educated me and my colleagues, knew or prepared us for. Exiles from Prague and Madrid and other cities in the 1960s, they painted this sort of vivid picture for us of this sort of heavenly city, which they called the European city. It's one of my first year projects, under that influence. And so despite its sort of almost the invisibility of this idea, they kind of gave it a kind of flesh, gave it a kind of life in our minds. And this is Alvaro Siza talking about, if you like, cultural transmission. This is actually him reflecting on his experience of working in the Netherlands, in The Hague. And I guess as you start to reflect on it, you see that these sort of ideas of the city or of urban institutions and their architectural form travel over almost sort of implausible distances. But they need carriers and they need receivers. And wherever I've washed up, first as a kind of apprentice and then as a journeyman, these ideas have been there and I've soaked them up. I mean, maybe they were just describing the kind of Central European cities or Mediterranean cities that they knew. But the sort of idea, or the seed of this idea that they planted, has, if anything, taken on greater force over the years in my mind. This is Edward Brew talking about, in a way, a kind of very succinct definition of this European city. Not sentimental, just actually this idea of continuity of place and like non-ephemeral objects, exceedingly neutral, atemporal, this sort of sense that actually it's the accumulation over time that gives both the physical structures but also, of course, the social structures their richness. This is my diploma project. In sleepy, semi-detached Cambridge, Dalibor Vesely, exile from Prague, made us believe in the city as a kind of vessel of common culture and in this idea of architecture as a kind of vehicle of city-making, and this sort of power of the intangible, of, I suppose, the cultural. On a year's exchange in Harvard, I had this sort of abrupt encounter with, I suppose, a kind of Mediterranean rationalism through Rafael Moneo, sort of preaching this sort of metaphysics of structure. And I had one particularly humiliating crit where he made me sort of pin my plans up. They were on I made the mistake of doing them on trace, and he made me pin them over each other. And my columns didn't line up, and I had a clever answer. I said, there's a transfer structure. And he said, which was actually a bit of a refrain from my time in Harvard, he said, you cannot do this. And he said, you cannot treat structure as decor, which is certainly a habit that I'd absolutely kind of imbued and from Cambridge. And I have to say, I've never forgotten that lesson. I think it was a fairly Jesuitical education for an Englishman. And then graduating in the teeth of the 1990s recession spared me, I suppose, the illusion that I could translate some sort of easy dream of the European city within the confines of London's architectural world. I ended up doing odd jobs in archaeology, digging at the city that Akhenaten built, Amarna. He built it in 4 years when he decided that Egypt should be monotheistic. And even there, so there was these sort of traces where I excavated the small Latin temple. And it had already been excavated several times. So, I mean, I think they, as a sort of amateur, they... all right, that's clearly not the right one. Pointer, no. Okay, not to worry. We came across these traces where even though they'd built this sort of city in a staggering hurry, they even though they built the city in a staggering hurry, they actually rebuilt this temple several times. We found this sort of remnant of a different alignment, a different wall. So it's like you were kind of digging in some sort of complex, kind of multi-layered city. And they'd only lived in it for 20 years or something until he was overthrown. I excavated a Baroque cardinal's villa in Rome, built by Pietro da Cortona. I think it was his first architectural work when he switched from painting, and he made the terrible mistake of, which probably seemed a great idea at the time, of building it on top of a spring. The spring gave water for the nymphaeum, but the house didn't last for very long. And then, I suppose, sort of absorbing these lessons and taking them into an office. I worked for Tim Ronalds, a very serious and interesting practitioner. Also, in a way, sort of, he's worked for kind of pioneering kind of modernist firm, Howard Killick Partridge and Amos. So there's a sort of sense seamless, even there, of a kind of transmission of ideas and disciplines from generation to generation. Building the theatre in Ilfracombe on the North Atlantic coast. The idea was to build the last one had decayed with sort of salt. It was a cast iron structure that had decayed with relentless salt spray. So the idea here was to build a structure entirely without steel, not entirely without steel, but still this sort of there's these conical brick structures, and I guess there I kind of learnt a bit about the durability, durability in structure, not as some sort of metaphysical construct, but as something just sort of real and tangible and palpable. And this sort of heroic moment of and community of building, kind of lashed by the winds and the spray. Then Bruges for Robert and Anne. We built a 1,200-seat concert hall in 2 years, from 3 years between winning the competition and opening, 2 years on site, just sort of breakneck speed. And we revelled in this kind of decisiveness. I mean, Paul said when we won it, I said, look at the programme, it's crazy. And he said, look, they'll never be able to keep up. Don't worry, it's fine, We'll do it. It's like over to them. And we revelled in the kind of decisiveness that this fast programme kind of forced on us all. But then we watched as it took 3 artistic directors, 4 financial directors, a kind of resident chamber orchestra that I think has slowly over a kind of decade have grown in. It's fantastic to go back and see this sort of shell kind of finally inhabited, but at the beginning it was a little bit like, it was kind of like a sort of hermit crab or something, this vast shell with a slightly empty life form within it. And I suppose that was one of the things that made me realise that buildings are actually straightforwardly difficult. It's actually, human institutions are the hard thing to construct, support, sustain. This is, I suppose, my first effort at sort of export, taking the kind of pathology of London to Antwerp, trying to find, I think it was very valuable for me in finding a kind of distance from the kind of condition I was a part of. This idea, public space and the privatised state, this just absolute contradiction we were kind of living. I'm not sure what the Belgian Flemish Architectural Public made of it. I think they were rather baffled. Why talk about politics? And this is the point that I started collaborating with Stephen and Chris. And I suppose that was just a sort of curiosity, a deep, deep curiosity about the city. I mean, possibly, you know, I might have been thinking or sort of saying, you know, talking about London, and I might even imply this now, that it'll collapse under the mass of its own contradictions. It won't, you know. It'll find a way. And actually, the interesting thing you then find is how this thing that is out of anyone's control evolves and changes and grows, and there's some aberrant forces at work, but there's also some corrective reactions. So actually, our first collaborations were not architectural ones. They were just spurred by curiosity, that we would meet once a week, 6:30 in the morning, before going into work in the offices we were working in. And we picked out 4 areas of the city that we would visit, and which we sustained over a couple of years. And the Lee Valley was one of them. That was actually just the edge of the Olympic side. And out of that, I suppose, we saw and discovered the kind of resilience of nature. I mean, this island is as toxic as they get. I think it's, you know, zinc and various heavy metals, but there's a resilience. It kind of now it's abandoned. It's going through a whole kind of almost as a process of natural remediation. We sort of saw the resilience of human institutions that, you know, despite the kind of pressure of real estate and whatever, certainly things like street markets, educational institutions, all sorts of things that actually, however inconvenient they might be to the march of speculation, you know, wouldn't and couldn't budge. And I guess these gave us some sort of seed of optimism. And I suppose our first projects, this was the first European project we did in Dartford. We won it, and then we went to meet the local authority in great excitement, and they said, "Do you know who owns the site?" So these were, I mean, there's actually sort of real kind of responses to this. They were going to build a university, extension of the University of Greenwich on the old Joyce Green Mental Hospital out in the marshes. So we said, oh, no, put it right there in the centre, you know. And I suppose there's this idea of reimagining the station, reimagining the life of the town, relocating the town hall off its sort of plinth beside the station into the kind of market square, and then a bit of housing on the side by the river as well. So it was this sort of kind of robust and I guess pretty ambitious response to rather febrile settings of, you know, just sort of crappy, neglected town with sort of sheds but without, you know, so it's a bit of a tightrope. I suppose we started developing this idea or understanding this idea of the city as a kind of collective project where you just take your place, you chip in your bit. So this is the project we then built for Amnesty. This is one of the first. This is actually what we showed them at competition stage. This was 2 old furniture factories, but it's a very historic site. The old Holywell Priory that was kind of smashed open and sold off. They ripped off all the lead and sold it. Was the first thing they did when Henry VIII dissolved or privatised the monasteries. So this is this kind of site that's actually got, I mean, there's a Georgian housing, a Victorian board school, all these things. And so actually trying to understand that, I mean, I'm not sure that was a particularly convincing response, and I don't think the client actually asked us to sort of go, they said, we love the idea, but we don't like the architecture. So we took it away and it came back like this sort of very robust, urban, neutral construction. I mean, there's a lot of transformation on the interior, but what this is, it's just a 4-metre wide strip that gives the building behind a stage for the lecture theatre, a cafe for the at the centre of the 5 floors of offices, a reception area, an exhibition area, a kind of foyer for the lecture theatre. So it's a sort of modest little building that on the one hand kind of completes or complements everything that these sort of big loading bays on the interior, but also then which kind of completes, or as I think one of the contractors said, oh yeah, it's kind of like it makes the street, doesn't it? There's a German critic who sort of came several years later and sort of said, oh yes, it's like wie eine Schlussstein in einem Gewölbe. It's kind of like a keystone in an arch. Same sentiment, different formulation. And I suppose this sort of sense of the city as or even the building as a kind of intergenerational project. In this case, I suppose us and Paul Robrecht. But equally, we were the 4th architects to work on this complex of buildings. We started in 1892, a kind of public library, 1901 public art gallery, 1985 extension by Cohen and Miller. So, you come along, you're latecomers. And I suppose what I learnt from Paul on this project was that when you are a latecomer and when you're just sort of doing these little sort of fragments, there's perhaps a little degree of exaggeration. There's a degree of mimesis that you observe very carefully the deep structure of what you find. You can't fight against that, so that possibly directs how you add. But equally, when you add in an assertive, or like I say, even possibly an exaggerated way. And so I suppose it was then in these there's a kind of institutional culture to this project as well. That this is an institution that for 100 years has been kind of bringing modern art to the east of London. And you realise that it's on the one hand, it's there's a kind of love and care, an affection for the building that people, the users have. It means you're working with kind of public property. You're treading on people's dreams. And the first thing they ask when the doors open is, have they messed it up? And I guess you have to be pretty thick-skinned, but the best response in a way you can hope for is, no, they haven't messed it up. There is also then this kind of culture, though, of the institution. It probably takes you, it's probably only as I go back now that I see, so we finished this in 2009, so it's 5 years on, you actually sort of see it with half a dozen exhibitions in each space, and I think it probably took them a couple of years to learn to use certainly a couple of the new spaces. This one, the first exhibition was Knockout, and then they had a kind of period of 3 years with, they really struggled to fill it. And so you sort of see how, even when there's the hermit crab, even with these sort of 2 new shells, and even when it's actually quite large, it sort of struggles to fill them initially. So there's always this gap between life and the kind of shells that we're inhabiting, and you just have to hope that you close that gap enough that it's bridgeable. As Fergus mentioned, Stephen and I have both been teaching at the London School of Economics. I mean, it's an interesting thing, not always rewarding, kind of teaching design in an institution where the majority aren't occupied with design, but it is also very stimulating, and we've had these sort of interesting, kind of provocative encounters with another exile, Richard Sennett from New York, and his reflections, his kind of provocations on the modern city, and what we're doing with our current economic structures to the city. Of course, what he does with here, when he talks about it, he's not saying that we got the process wrong, or we need to do it. Yeah, he says we need to do it differently. But what he says is, it's actually, this is a question of critical imagination. It's not a question of do the process differently. So it's actually, with this, he's actually laying down the gauntlet to us as architects, as urban designers, to imagine it differently. Which is kind of the challenge we've tried to take up. So this is then in Bankside. This is a project we won in 2006. Public space framework. Bankside is the area to the south of the Thames with the Tate Modern, the old Bankside power station, at its kind of focus. And I mean, with an institution, with an ancient institution, or 100 years old, whatever, you are working with a collective imagination. But then when you move into the city, you're working with a collective imagination in a way that's much harder to kind of bottle or define. It's contested. It's coveted by people who who want to turn land value into cash. It's jealously guarded by those who have their roots there. It's kind of territorial. And that was the kind of field that we, I guess, sort of stumbled into, not entirely innocently, but and this is then just a brief historical build-up. This is the structure of the area in the 1740s. So you can see very much this sort of the medieval high street out of London. That's London Bridge is just off the edge of that map. And then these sort of medieval lanes traced through the marshy land. This is then Blackfriars Bridge, 1820s, kind of Georgian, grand straight line, actually spectacular terrace at the abutment of the bridge. New Victorian bridges, slowly sort of linking as South London grew, more and more bridges, the carving, this sort of almost radial pattern across South London. A big set piece of Georgian Square, but other than that, there's very little kind of formal, classical, kind of conventional public space. When they first brought the railways to London, they stopped at Deptford and all sorts of places sort of miles away, and Parliament sat and debated where should they, what should we do with the railways, whatever. And then as they were debating, it took them sort of, or as they waited for the Royal Commission to report, the railway company sort of built in, they sort of brought the railways into London Bridge. They had another debate, and then as they did that, the railway companies then brought the stations right into the heart of the city, carving a swathe through this area, particularly in Bankside, right next to Southwark Cathedral. This is the areas of bomb damage in the Second World War. And then more modest incremental additions, sort of widenings of viaducts and the like, and closes and industrial estates and yards in the post-war period. So it's a kind of pretty tangled heritage. It's a pretty tangled legacy. It's you look at it and you think it's very hard to find the structure. I mean, again, what we did with this to start off with, we walked it. We walked it very. You first have to kind of know it with your feet or know it with your eyes before you can start to kind of pretend to sketch its future. And I suppose we distilled this kind of process of creation and destruction into this idea of these sort of streams, these north-south meandering paths, these rides carved through the fabric, linking across between the bridges, and these clearings, these sort of random pockets of open space. So, and this kind of analysis suggested a kind of idea of the city is not a conventional city structure, something more like a forest with a kind of a different, more complex structure. The institutions were sort of scattered, but actually there were these kind of, in amongst the areas, if you like, the territorial offices or the territorial kind of housing blocks, there were these areas kind of shared values, shared facilities, which we sought to support. So, I mean, this is a project that starts really almost with the Tate Modern at the north of that image, and its ambition to extend the Tate Modern 2 project that's currently under construction with Herzog de Meuron's project. That entailed building on a public park, and that in turn, if you like, set off this coalition of developers, public sector, Tate Modern, local council, Southwark, to, I suppose, try and compensate for this loss of space. It's a mathematical thing at one level, and I suppose what we did is we flipped it, we turned that into something qualitative. We tried to sort of stretch it, I think initially it was focused very much on the area to the north of the viaducts, focused on the business improvement district, one of these kind of quasi-public interest organisations. And we got them to agree to stretch the boundary much wider. So in a way it becomes a kind of almost modest redistributive project, redistributing public space in the sense that you're building on a bit of it which some people kind of were very attached to, but I think for a lot of people it was a fairly indifferent park, and then reinvesting in a wider network of public spaces. Obviously it's redistributive in the sense that it's actually responding to the kind of opportunistic development of development sites. It's a kind of reinvestment in the public realm, in the kind of connective tissue in between those blocks. And I mean, this name, the urban forest, is an interesting one. Stephen started off with the enchanted forest, and then someone took us aside and sort of quietly said, if I was you, I'd drop the enchanted. But the forest bit stuck. I mean, I felt uneasy with it initially, but what was interesting is because it's not a formal idea, it's a kind of suggestive idea. It's counterintuitive, at the same time it's got a fit. This is the area where Shakespeare's theatres, the Globe, were. They were outside the law. So in the sense in a infuriating kind of vague way, there was a kind of fit. And the interesting thing about that was that it kind of allowed different people to project different things onto it, to imagine different things with it. And I think in a way the vagueness was one of the kind of strengths. At the same time, that vagueness was embodied in very bloody careful drawings of what this thing amounted to. So it's not just, it's a word, it's a slogan. It was embodied in a kind of overall ambition of this complex order, and then in a set of projects. So it's sort of strategy and projects. It's not a master plan. There had been a master plan by Richard Rogers previously. It had gone nowhere. You can't do a master plan if you don't own land. And this is sort of, in the city you have multiple landholdings, multiple interests. So all we could do is kind of prompt and have a strategy about what we're trying to achieve, and then this set of projects that embodied this sort of vague but tantalising and kind of generous vision that these would not be territorial public spaces. This is the kind of first sketch for the space to the south of Tate Modern, this sort of public space that opened up. So as configured as a kind of grove of tall canopied pine trees with turbine hall art installations underneath the canopy, a kind of prefiguration. So rather than being a kind of empty plaza in front of the Tate Modern, the idea that this would be almost like full, and that the turbine hall space, this sort of amazing void where installation pieces are placed, that's the public space. Proposal for the viaduct arches to become a combination of small business space and small-scale cultural programme. And then this project for a little neglected triangle of, a little leftover triangle of space, carved by the railway viaduct, which you can see in the background. The Victorians were so terrified of, any form of public gathering. I think actually public gathering was banned between 1848 and 1871 or something, and that's the significance of Speaker's Corner, it was the only place where you were able to gather and speak your mind. And their way of avoiding having any public space was to build little, public toilets and tank traps and monuments to kind of, and that's why the fountains are there in Trafalgar Square, is to kind of make it harder to have demonstrations there. So this little public toilet building was a legacy of that kind of regressive project. It's since become a cafe, but and it's got these two magnificent plane trees growing up through it. So our project was, it's an element of taking over, closing a road, opening up the public space, and then a little canopy, this sort of fantasy, this capriccio that of the cafe as a kind of woodland hut. Kind of translating this, I suppose it's the geometry of the space, the geometry of the viaduct, these sort of echoes into this diagonal grid that structures the paving of the space. I suppose there's an element here of kind of negotiation with people, of course, negotiation with the material and the physical. There comes a moment, though, where you can't just be defined by everything around you. It is then this sort of moment, you need to find a moment of strength. And you can see here, if you want to make a durable public landscape, stuff has to lock together. It's not an assembly, it's not an airfix kit or a kind of mechano set that you bolt together and it's strong. Actually, you have to make things you have to kind of sculpt and craft things if they're going to be strong and durable. And that's these sort of figure of eights pieces are the kind of place where this geometry, this idea, this responsive, moderately supple idea, actually sort of turns into something that has a strength and integrity of its own. We've realised, if you like, two parts out of the kind of four parts of the project. The paving and the canopy. I've done them in, I think, 2 completely separate years even, which still leaves a bit of the light and the public seating to build. Anxiety on the client's part that, if they put the benches down, there's sort of beautiful bench in green oak, like a kind of fallen tree. If they put benches down, the street drinkers will return. Interestingly, though, the sort of sense, actually leaving it as a clearing, leaving it open, has kind of provoked a kind of occupation that you just can't plan for. You can't even imagine. And I suppose that's the other side. That's the resilience of London. There is a kind of horror vacui. It's like, I don't know, cutting a hole in the kind of in the beach, and it just fills up with water. It's if you create any kind of clear space in London, it'll fill. And so the cafe, someone approached them. They started doing children's parties. There's poetry publishers used it for book launches. People have organised. There's an Institute of Contemporary Music. They've organised gigs there. It's a modest little public space, and it's as a result of, if you like, this clearing and this just a sort of little touch of generosity. It is something that has taken on a, like I said, sort of totally unpredictable level of life. So this is a kind of the city as a collective project. It's opportunistic. The funding, they came to us in 2011 and said, we're going to... we've got the Paralympic delegates coming in a year's time, and none of the bridges are accessible. So we did that whole strip of the Riverside Walk in that kind of 12 months. That's that top image. So it's sort of incremental, but you draw a phasing drawing, and it's kind of that's not how it happens. I mean, the Flatiron Square, the stone was on its way over on a kind of barge, and was, I think, virtually sort of told to turn around and go back because of, what was that, I suppose, 2008 kind of, or 2009, local government cuts and all of that. I think finally then they turned around again and they delivered it and built it. But it's fragile. It's fragile. I mean, you would be... for a long time I thought this is a sort of, a nice set of drawings, but it's not going anywhere. Yet, to my great surprise and pleasure, it has actually sort of fleshed out more and more. And so this one, middle left, is a kind of temporary project that someone did on a vacant site, using recycled materials and distributing plants out to the community. So it's incremental in an unpredictable way, an unfazed way. It's collective in the sense that it's not us, it's not just us and our mates. It's there's a project by Vogt for the space to South Tate Modern. There are temporary projects, there's projects by kind of colleagues in London. So it is a collective project as well. And we've struggled to find a name for kind of this approach. We've used incrementalism, but someone said, well, that's sort of, I don't know, that's already identified with a kind of practice in the third world, or sort of other things. You could talk about negotiation and the imagination, but then it all gets pretty tangled. So I mean, the danger is it all sounds like it's just sort of moderation, and we just sort of sit there and sort of moderate and arbitrate and make people tea, and then the project happens. It isn't like that. There is this sort of element of suppleness and bending over backwards. That's the spineless bit. But there is also this element where you sort of push and you sort of got this many constraints, and it has to take on a kind of force and a strength and an integrity. So which is where I kind of turn to the Sage of Springfield, and I think the best definition of what we're trying to do, how we do it, both in sort of human terms, in social terms, and in kind of physical terms, it's feisty but spineless. And I suppose this is probably then perhaps the ideal kind of skill set that's, London has been our playground and our school, where we've learned to kind of transform what we found and so turn its formlessness into strength, but also taught us, we've learned the lesson how not to be bullied by the English establishment, which was a very valuable skill when we came to build the castle. It looks like this sort of pastoral England, beautifully escapist, uber English. And that's the kind of tradition, and that's the sort of elegiac tradition of English ruins. I mean, pretty much all of them, the abbeys, the ruined abbeys and the ruined castles, and this has got one of each, are the result of a kind of ruthless and powerful kind of process of state formation. This parish church is the remaining quarter of a chantry church established by the Grey family and dissolved by Henry VIII. They ripped off the lead roofs, sold the lead. The nave stood for another 50 years, and then someone just thought, well, this is not going anywhere, and pulled it down and built a small tower. So that's this strange proportion. It's very tall for a short parish church. That comes from that kind of act of kind of wanton destruction and, Henry's kind of centralisation of the state and sidelining of the church as any kind of rival power, economic power or, authority. The castle was the second home, I think, of the Grey family, who tried to stop Henry's daughter Mary from succeeding to the throne, put their daughter Jane on the throne, and she lasted 9 days, Lady Jane Grey, and then she and her father were kind of hunted down like dogs and dispatched. Their castle was dispatched as well. It was slighted, which, if you've ever been to a kind of slighted castle, systematic. It's made systematically redundant. So the absence of the curtain wall is not some kind of romantic relic of, long abandonment. It's systematic. It's deliberate. It's defensively redundant. This pastoral ancient landscape sits in the West Midlands, birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, and now this sort of landscape of suburban housing and very skilled kind of industrial businesses in kind of rather crappy sheds. It had obviously the castle had built up over the centuries, was replaced in a way redundant in terms of prestige at the time that everyone was building country houses. The Lord Daventry built, the second Lord Daventry built Arbury Hall, a neo-Gothic country house down the road, and thereafter this was a kind of minor house for rental. Nursing home in the Second World War, then hotel, interestingly, because if you like, that decline was also a kind of popularisation. Anyone who had a christening or a wedding reception did go to Astley Castle. So it wasn't just a kind of sad affair, it actually was a kind of form of democratisation. Until in 1978, I think the lease expired, and the next day a fire broke out with some fairly extensive damage. But I suppose we're not. Ruins are a very unusual condition in our world, because if something burns down or falls down or whatever, the insurance, you call the insurance, and what the insurer's their mantra is, we'll restore it as it was. Which is exactly what they did when my upstairs neighbour left their kind of kitchen tap running and flooded my flat. They come in, clear you out, dry it out, restore it exactly as it was, and you say, can I do that bit that way? And say, no, exactly as it was. So then, so it's in this sort of state of decay, and insurers weren't going to pay out, so people projected their ideas, their ambitions onto it. The Landmark Trust is a very interesting organisation. It almost a spin-off. It was set up by Sir John Smith in the 1960s. He was the head of the National Trust. He was finding there were a lot of properties they couldn't salvage. So he and he'd made a bob or two property developing. And he kind of reinvested it in a way in these sort of early projects, setting up this trust and rescuing small, economically useless, I suppose, marginally located properties, which, of course, that thing of actually almost being out of the economic kind of chain is precisely what makes them then valid and fantastic holiday houses. And the basic model is that the rental for holiday, the holiday rental pays for the maintenance and upkeep and kind of ongoing or expanding project of the trust. I think they now have something like 150, 170 properties. Some people, it's like, okay, this is like holiday housing for posh people. Landmark Trust would say it's about £30 a head per night. If you fill every bed, it's actually not a It's a very congenial and interesting way to share a kind of historic experience with friends and family. This is just to spin you through the evolution of the castle. So it started off with this sort of keep, kind of fortified manor at the end. That's probably the beginning of the Norman period. It's 2 metre thick walls. This is the extensions of the Grey family in the 15th century. So sort of Gothic, then added to in the 17th century by the Chamberlain family who took it over. One is more in sort of Elizabethan glory house kind of style. The bit to the north then was all the kind of half-timbered, jettied construction. So, I mean, people liked having long. It was very fashionable to have long galleries then. So, they built this half-timbered kind of cantilevered glazed gallery, which, as you would probably not be surprised, was in very poor condition when we found it. This is an expansion of the 19th century. And when we came to it, so it was this sort of empty shell, and we focused with our brief was a 4-bedroom house, which was big enough to kind of fill about a third of the castle, and we took the decision, fundamentally in a kind of spirit of continuity, that the core from which it had grown would be the core that we would inhabit. It had bloody big gashes in it, these giant gaping holes in it. We built a sketch model and tried it out, and you can see that the scale of the 15th and 17th century wings is much more congenial to living in. But we just felt no, that continuity, that core trumps everything. So that's where we located. And as you can see, the bedrooms and bathrooms on the ground floor, and we take then a big hall on the first floor for living, dining and kitchen. This is sort of more or less what we found, in the sense it was almost fully intact in places. This kind of proud silhouette, this kind of very kind of clear structure. These sort of strange orphaned structures, and remember that fireplace because you'll see it again. Orphaned, and I think actually our first response was to knock it down in the competition scheme, which couldn't really see its point or what it was. And someone asked us, sort of took us aside and said, perhaps you could reconsider that. I think it's quite important. And you can see just this sort of, I don't know, where does the brick stop or the stone stop and the rubble start, or where does the ashlar stop and the rubble start, and where does the rubble stop and just a sort of mud and kind of debris. Something that kind of, you looked at it from one angle and it was a ruin in the grand tradition. You looked at another angle, it's just a sort of chaotic pile of stones. And this is actually as we found it. So, in a way there's this, in a way I think what we've done, which I'll come to, has this sort of wonderful quality of feeling self-evident. It wasn't at all self-evident. That's what I'd like to say. We had this sort of grappling, teetering kind of chaos that we had to first imagine kind of cleared, opened up. To make it safe, we had to demolish quite a lot. To demolish, we had to have planning permission. To have planning permission, we had to do a scheme. So we had to do a scheme on kind of sketchy knowledge of the detail, and I have to say, to their great credit, the heritage bodies consented this sketchy scheme and allowed us to evolve it and refine it and respond as we went along, rather than kind of binding us to a kind of forcing us to build what we had consented, because that wouldn't have been great. We, in this sort of ruptured kind of tradition of continuity, we evoked some Mediterranean friends, which, and I suppose because they weren't party to this or weren't part of this, because they were so focused on restoration for the Landmark Trust, this seemed, and even actually just sort of pulling these pictures out of books, kind of seemed to them quite fresh. This idea that actually these things could, the centuries could just coexist comfortably and kind of directly. We had to kind of, this is an excerpt from one of the series of storybooks we did, to kind of argue our point without trying to prove the point. So you may not be able to read it, but this is then actually trying to take the ruin from this sort of elegiac, comforting, reassuring kind of English tradition to something more unsettling. So Piranesi, obviously, but then this sort of influence of the ruin on the conception of modern architecture, the Villa Savoir in ruins. But Auguste Perret saying architecture is what makes beautiful ruins. He's talking about Versailles, which for him was just sort of pasteboard and, sort of big stage set with a confusion of plaster work and stonework. He's saying ruin is structure. So in a way, he's saying the same thing as Raphael Menaire was sort of berating me with before. Our initial idea was you put almost half a house, you put a house and a half of the castle, you occupy that oldest part, and then the newer 15th and 17th century parts, you leave open to the sky as kind of open courts. That evolved into this. This is then just a working model, sketching over it. As you can see, just sort of starting to imagine this sort of, not just the sort of textures of it, but the rhythms of life in it. This idea of that as a courtyard where you dine, which would actually have these sort of shafts of sunlight coming through it. This idea that we'd actually, which came from our structural engineer, that he said, if you want to protect it, you should roof it. I said, I can't roof it, it must be really horribly gloomy. So we sort of settled on the partially roofing, like a cornice, keep the weather off the walls, but then actually bind it. And this was initially the idea of doing that with concrete beams. And this idea of that first floor hall, again, as this sort of big, messy, tolerant space, child scribbling on the floor, the sense that actually it would be, I suppose, where the medieval idea of living and the modern idea of living kind of come and approximate each other again. So the scheme as we presented at a competition, which in many ways didn't change a lot, but in the ways it changed profoundly. So if you like, we were having to almost mentally undress the ruin, clear away this rubble in order to come to a kind of proposition. This idea that this fundamental idea that the new construction would stabilise, would buttress and tie the new construction, the existing construction. So, and this is in its simplest form, almost just a sort of concrete T that just binds this sort of rotten tooth together. And it was strange because it was exactly this, is the fact that then the past was dependent on the present that gave us our real kind of liberty. Because normally it's a question of what am I allowed to do? We've had conservation officers doing a drawing and saying that's what I'll let you do on other projects. Here, both because they were desperate and they knew it was about to fall down, and because the past was dependent on the present, we had a totally different setup, totally different kind of liberty to actually reflect on what the integrity of this thing was. So it became a kind of question of I suppose it's a form of negotiating, not negotiating with other people, but negotiating these sort of found conditions, negotiating a kind of a random broken edge here, a kind of remnant of an arch there, a kind of collapsed wall here, and finding something that, the principle was we do as little as possible. We build as little new construction as possible, but nonetheless that we that finds, like I say, it's almost a struggle with formlessness. And the answer is not some strong form. The answer the answer we proposed was something in between, something that's got that kind of hybrid, kind of complex form. This is a question of negotiating even just plumb what's vertical? You know, the walls are doing this. And this question of where you know, which for probably about 3 years we ignored, we didn't even think of. And then sort of suddenly we were kind of on site and having to say exactly which line we're going to put the walls in. So coming up with the principle that the brick always sits behind. We did look at the idea of actually the brick following the walls. So negotiating, I suppose, yes, and then these sort of sketchy, blobby people just kind of form of, a primitive form, but a kind of powerful form of empathy, trying to imagine. So it's not all, there's an element of structure, there's an element of diagram, but there's an element of experience. You know, you have a memory, you have these memories of staying in places of, you know, shared living, and just trying to imagine this these sort of moments of empathy, trying to understand, I suppose, how an atmosphere, a behaviour, and a kind of a texture start to reinforce each other. This sort of slightly pathetic array of the sort of graveyard of failed options and things we explored. But I suppose what I'd say is, you know, so if we negotiated it through drawings and models, drawings, for me, are a thought in action. Yeah, you think it, you have a blank piece of paper, you don't get some sort of CAD file that has sort of 65 layers and 10 times as much information as you need. You start off with a kind of absolute minimum, and then with this economy of the line, you can find it. You find an idea, and that's what's in each of those kind of preceding drawings. The model, however, is a fantastic tool for kind of testing, and that's exactly what we did with this. And over kind of, you know, I wonder what we spent 5 years doing, but a lot of the time we spent arguing about how the solution that worked in this place would, you know, how we'd find a corollary or a kind of appropriate family resemblance in another place. It would never be a question of finding a system that where one answer, you know, one size fits all, but every moment that we kind of felt that we'd sort of nailed it, you know, you'd come across a new question, and that in a way is almost this sort of, I suppose it's a dialogue, it is a negotiation between different approaches, different personalities, but also then this sort of dialectic through which we kind of work with all this kind of concrete material, all these sort of friable edges and weird geometries, and sort of try and turn that into something that's got a kind of coherence and a deliberateness. The idea of roofing over the courts was very contentious. Lovely in the Mediterranean, but it won't work in England. It'd be very gloomy. We took the model to the artificial sky at University College London, attached a lot of kind of diodes, and it was like sort of taking it into an operating theatre, wires and diodes to it, and measured how much light there would be in various spaces, what the daylight factor would be. Actually had a very useful, I think, the numbers were kind of moderately useful. We could say, okay, there's a daylight factor of 5 in the hall. Don't worry, it won't be gloomy. You know, it's a castle. What do you expect? Castles are meant to be gloomy, but no, we managed to offer some reassurance with, I don't know, you might say it's pseudoscience. What was actually very interesting, though, was then having this, you know, the technician's knowledge of daylight. I guess that's the difference between sort of software model and actually doing it in person. And he was sort of talking about transitions and, I suppose, the grades, I don't remember the detail, but the grades by which the human eye adjusts between different light levels. You don't want to be kind of having these abrupt transitions. So we started to kind of come to the view that maybe these partially roofed courts would actually ease that transition from bright sky into gloomy interior, rather than kind of hindering it. In a way, it's like building a kind of modernist patio house with a ancient kind of, I suppose, a Gothic brise-soleil. And we realised that this thing, because we had a kind of house at a core and then this perforate wall around it, it would just be like a giant sundial with the light kind of animating and stirring this kind of collage of the centuries. We used the model to test finishes, so the 1 to 50 model finishes, detail. We recorded this in a book. I mean, having kind of worked enough for the English establishment, we realised that, you know, we had to give chapter and verse. We had to tell them exactly what they were getting, exactly where, and exactly why. And so, rather than being hit by this sort of wall of rejection of why aren't you using oak, why aren't you using veneer of this, or why don't we paint the walls, we then had anticipated that and used these images, and then they say, oh, but you've left off a kind of a beading from there. It's very important you should put that on. They hadn't I think they thought it was some sort of fancy computer model. They didn't realise that it was just a crude old model that you could stick your head into. But it did the job. So out of this, we distilled this sort of moment of clarity. We distilled the idea into kind of 3 elements. The rotten tooth that we inherited, having cleared away the unsalvageable, unstable fabric. This kind of brick and concrete armature that would bind the stone shell together. As you can see, like a kind of as thin as possible, like a kind of braiding. This idea that we'd initially land the concrete beams on the rubble, and we thought, well, how do you do that? It's just sort of painful, and so the concrete never touches the rubble. It's always mediated by this, by the brick, and if you like, that sort of sense that the new architecture or the new structure has to be strong, has to be hard, but it also has to meet the existing structure in a way that's soft. And I think that's where a lot of the work was. And then this layer of carpentry. So where the kind of masonry armature keeps it sublime, keeps it ruinous, keeps it kind of these big gashes. It's the job of the carpentry and the joinery to kind of give it measure and warmth. This is the almost invisible work done by the builders over a kind of year and a bit, stabilising the ruin, clearing out all the decay, and just repointing, relaying the deep stone walls. We selected a Danish brick because they could deliver. They're 35 millimetres high, so very fine, like a kind of Roman tile brick. Which we tried out another one, which even we quite liked the colour of, possibly even more. And it was coming in, I think it came in 45 millimetre modules, and even that kind of 10 millimetre difference was very strongly kind of palpable in that encounter with kind of broken edges. So I suppose this is a thing that I guess you have to make a decision based on, you know, a couple of dozen bricks piled up against the edge. But I tell you what, it's a lot better than thinking that you can make that decision or that you need to make that decision based on a bit of paper back in your comfortable office. So there's a lot of kind of testing on site that we went through to explore the decisions or to underpin the decisions. We did a sample panel of the brickwork before. This is actually one of the first piers going up. So you can see it's like a honeycomb, or they're hollow, but with a series of clay block diaphragms, and inside this is I think it's actually Belgian, Snellbouwsteen, fast building stone, clay blocks. We chose that because concrete and brick expand differently, so we wanted to just do it all in have a greater thermal consistency. So they are these sort of hollow, deep but strong elements, backfilled with aggregate to bind them back to the existing broken edges. The diaphragms are bonded in every 5th course or something so these headers. Here, this seam of headers is then where the diaphragm is bonded into the facework. It's a quarter lap bond. A Dutch architect wrote to us and told us what it's called, but we said, oh, is it really? We just sort of drew it until it sort of looked like it worked. And we drew a lot of different variants of it. I think we called it a Flemish garden wall bond or something, which I don't think exists. But what you can see is it's a quarter lap, so you get this sort of diagonal movement, but when it hits a kind of jagged edge, it's not like a kind of train crash, which, if you do a half lap or kind of stretcher bond, it really looked incredibly violent. You wouldn't believe that a brick bond could have so much difference, but so it has this sort of, it is exactly this thing of how do the hard meets the broken in a strong but soft way. We kept the gashes. The idea was, I guess that's why it's not just restorative. It's not just reoccupying. It is actually, we felt that sort of Time the Destroyer had done a pretty good job, and like I say, if castles are gloomy, then keep those openings, keep those gashes, was what we felt. So this is the lintel. Of course, there's a moat, so you can't just sort of crane stuff in very easily. So this is a temporary crane at the limit of its capacity. I think Chris did the calculations several times and certainly spent several hours on the phone trying to persuade these people that they could in fact do it. It's a hollow lintel. You can see the kind of ribs. So it's basically almost like permanent formwork. So it's a 7.5 metre long concrete lintel at full stretch in order to kind of keep these gashes, with the BBC West Midlands cameraman in the foreground there. And that's the bit that, if you like, ties the heart of the house together. The lintels bearing on other lintels, or beams bearing on other beams, it's very much a kind of motif of Paul Robrecht's work, Robrecht and Dam's work. When we were finishing the Whitechapel, we were detailing this and refining this project when we were finishing the Whitechapel, and we would go around, and I suppose we sort of realised what he had done on this project. These sort of very simple rooms, each with this sort of powerful kind of transgressive gesture. There's one, my favourite gallery is the kind of first floor gallery where there's just a kind of doorway punched into the corner of the room, so it kind of goes around that corner and goes through. You can't hang works there because it's the corner, and it's a sort of beautiful, kind of beautifully subversive gesture. Kind of attacks the architecture. It encourages this diagonal movement. So we're sort of reflecting on this, and I kind of built up a whole idea that this was sort of Paul and Hilda kind of working with this idea of Gordon Matter Clark and his sort of attack on architecture, and I sort of got very carried away with this, and we sort of ended up with this solution. I put that to Paul, and he said, no, it was Lucio Fontana was what we were interested in, so no, you're not really right. But, anyway, whatever the accuracy of that, of my interpretation, it gave us a real kind of grist to kind of find a kind of this combination of strength and weakness at the heart of the house. This sort of bit where the 15th century wall meets the 12th century wall should have been the strongest part of the house. It was the weakest, and that's, in a way, what this kind of moment resolves. So keeping this sort of sublime scale with these this masonry construction, these big concrete lintels. A dozen kind of conditions where I suppose this sort of sublime scale isn't appropriate. Top left, the lift opening. In the middle, the kitchen, how you fit a kitchen in a big medieval hall. This is a kind of idea of, I suppose, a medieval fireplace, the fireplace where you have the hearth and you have the range, translated into a kind of diaphragm construction. This is actually like a kind of cantilever staircase, so that each lintel bears on each other. It is, they do. The engineer came back to us with a lintel kind of bearing on the next diaphragm, and then this little bit of kind of fakey cool brickwork, and we said, no, it's got to work. It's got to actually carry the weight, otherwise we don't want to do it. So like I say, this thing that's, in the one hand, it's a kind of very clear, this sort of simple structure. On the other hand, every encounter, every junction requires a modicum of improvisation. Even including to when we were on site, finding out how you fit a window into what at first pass in the gloom and rain had looked like a kind of passable window opening, and it isn't. And this is then, we even started then using reclaimed bricks, because our bricks were not the same size as some of the Victorian bricks. So using reclaimed bricks and the like to make these, to patch, repair and bind this whole language, if you like, of almost sort of Baltic Gothic. I mean, it's got nothing to do with the history of Astley, but it's a kind of intuitive response. We didn't order any special bricks, and so that actually forced us into this whole kind of world of, like I say, improvised Baltic Gothic. The carpentry is, like I say, what gives the house measure and warmth. Someone sold it to a funder saying, oh, we're going to do it all in oak. We said, no, don't say that. We can't afford it, and we don't want to do it. We actually welcomed the chance to do it in, so this is laminated pine, pretty bog standard. What is worth pointing out here is that you see that central beams in upstand, so actually that it's the strongest elements, and actually also the roof, which is just to do with levels. But that doing the carpentry in upstand, the primary structure in upstand, means that it's all got this tautness, it's got this lightness. So, like that hollow beam, hollow lintel, the carpentry also slightly conceals its work, its strength, even though it is, absolutely doing that work. This is then the partitions dividing up the space, forming the bathrooms, bedrooms, all in stud work. And this is a little bit of José van Hey. This idea of the kind of the carpentry or the joinery module that binds all a set of random openings together. It's a little bit of Alejandro de la Sota. This idea that actually it's the carpentry or the joinery that sets the module, and the brickwork. The brickwork, you just cut it. You've got if you've got a fine bond, the brickwork accommodates itself. So this idea, it's kind of counterintuitive. This idea that actually it's the kind of it's the carpentry and joinery that is the kind of repetitive, almost industrial kind of assembled component. Taken through into the stair then as a kind of also then a sort of stud enclosure, open. Obviously then it becomes hybrid because if it was fully stud work, you'd have a whole set of studs on the middle as well. It's kind of a spiral, or it's 3 flights up to the top, incredibly constrained. We'd originally had the stair out of the house in the old location of the spiral stair, and this is almost like a second living room. And I'm really glad that, in a way, it's almost like that relentless pressure of economy. Each stage we finished the design, we'd finish stage C, and the design was, 20% over budget, we'd cut. We finished stage D and we barely changed a thing and it was 20% over budget, so we'd cut again. And, so on through each phase until, and the courtyard roofs were kind of, every time we were over budget, the courtyard roofs were on the way out. And so each time we had this sort of intense incentive to actually cut things down, cut down the material specification, not use oak veneer, not use oak, this is just a kind of terracotta tile for the floor, and keep that economy so that we would actually realise the integrity of the project. So completed, I feel like what it does is it reinstates that kind of profile of the castle without, if you like, filling it. So it's not light. That would be too much to claim, but it does have a kind of form of sketchiness and openness. It's got this porous kind of quality where you come to it and see all the way through. There's no glass in that external kind of perimeter at all. These courtyards, so if you remember that sort of chimney breast, that orphaned chimney breast, that sketch of a kind of external dining court. This is a house that is actually built around these kind of moments of collective sociability. Very late in the day, we plumbed in a kind of new chimney to actually make that chimney breast a usable fireplace. The church, this sort of remnant of the church, closes off that view to the south. These rooms, these bedrooms are kind of almost the kind of result of that, or that kind of internal discipline of saying all new partitions which aren't on the old masonry lines will be in joinery. So they're birch plywood, sycamore facing, because they cut up all birch trees to make plywood, so you can't get even modest dimensions of birch. Pine, laminated pine ceiling. So it's kind of, we've got half a dozen types of wood. That's oak, which is then bleached with a kind of lye, which is again a sort of technique we did with Paul at the Whitechapel. Brickwork, stone, all kind of in a way, these rooms that could have been kind of very challenging, very unsatisfactory, very much the result, a collision of materials through tone, through rhythm, through edging, bound together. The dining space where you then look out, and almost as if someone has conveniently knocked out the mullions to give you this sort of framed picture out to the medieval lake. And these openings in the courts, then they let the weather in. It is this sort of house that, like I say, it's like a sundial. It's also it's an impluvium as well. This sort of sense that you're not just in touch with the sort of centuries. You're in touch with the seasons. And it is. My in-laws hired it, and we spent a weekend snowed in with sort of 3 generations of us actually sort of rubbing along quite satisfactorily, because it's a big old house, but we spent 2 days in that big first floor room, and what I sort of realised was that probably what we spent a lot of this time doing was actually just sort of finessing its design so that it wasn't just this big barn, this tunnel, which you see in the kind of first drawings, that it is a room that's got a satisfying enclosure, that it's actually also a series of rooms. So you can see the series of atmospheres where we existed sort of side by side. And where, if you like, this, I suppose, dialogue of the generations takes place against this backdrop of the centuries. The thing we didn't expect at all, I mentioned it had been a hotel and that this had been a popular kind of venue. What we didn't expect at all was that when it went out on the market and opened for hire, that it would be very popular with locals. So there's a guy who hired it, who lived 3 miles away. He was an electrician who was marrying an American woman, and he wanted to impress her. So he took her there for his honeymoon. And his grandmother visited them there, and passed through the courtyard, passed the timber rest, and said, "That's where your grandfather proposed to me." So there's a sense that actually, continuity of stones is, all very well, but actually, the essence of it, the essence is that, it is this sort of preservation of fire, not the worship of the ashes. We had Anne Levitt, who'd been married there in 1968, wrote to us and said, "I came expecting to hate it. I thought you'd have sort of broken all my memories. And you didn't." So like I say, this sort of thing, with a public building, a building that people feel is a public property, the best thing you can do is actually not to mess it up. That's the highest level of achievement. So in a way, that kind of wash of local support, prize, fantastic. Fantastic kind of and really sort of warming professional and public response that has really buoyed us up. But I'd hate to give you the impression that everyone likes it. Because history is contested. I don't know if you have this with your curriculum here, but we have an education secretary who's trying to rewrite the curriculum about how the First World War is represented, and all this history is contested. People feel, like I say, and so when you work on an existing building, and this building that's going to public property, you sacrifice a lot. You sacrifice a lot of freedom. You accept a lot of limitations. But what you do have at your kind of grasp, which I don't think you can call on with a new building, is you have this kind of ability to touch the collective imagination immediately. And that's something that I kind of, yes, I mean, it's not, working with existing buildings isn't something that we deliberately walked into, but that's something that now I value about that tremendously. So, like I say, this kind of confidence, this support has given us a lot of confidence, probably some overconfidence. So we've taken this out on the road and we've tried a kind of full contact approach, turning a monastery in Mechelen in Belgium into a library. This is competitions. We got 0 points from the jury. I think it was a real kind of, I don't know, it's probably just a kind of faux pas, building a little, or proposing a little lecture hall. I mean, there's a lecture hall in the brief, but proposing a little lecture hall in the body of the nave. This sort of cultural transgression. We were invited to compete for a new workshop and office for a German engineering firm in Winnenden outside Stuttgart on the incorporating the remains of an old brickworks that they'd started pulling down. We presented continuity. They said, well, the brickworks was built with slave labour and we associate the chimneys with sulphur pollution, so actually we don't really want continuity, thank you very much. We tried it at the Opera House. We're just not establishment enough. We were invited to compete for a water tower, a 1930s water tower. Our competitors, Surtees and Bates, who won the project, very wisely and sensibly said, we'll pull it down, we'll build a tower there. We built this beautiful, elaborate scheme, a kind of patio house at the base of this concrete water tower. And then I thought, why did I think that some kind of toff who wants to sort of leave a legacy to his estate would want to hold on to a kind of industrial relic? So what that leaves us is, where do we go from Astley? Well, where we've ended up is it's partly faute de mieux, but it's also actually what we believe in and what we care about. London's most hated roundabout, the Elephant and Castle. And this was the future once. Bombed, it was the sort of centre of churches, theatres, cinemas. It was absolutely, it was the Piccadilly Circus of South London. Bombed, and I suppose the bombing kind of legitimated a kind of degree of destruction. Abercrombie Plan, this sort of progressive project for London, identified it as this sort of nexus for this place where the inner ring road, I think it's this point, is this the pointer? Yes, there, bingo. This kind of node in London's road network, which then obviously legitimated further sort of massive destruction. This sort of idea of, I don't know what short, is this a public space, is it a plaza, it's towers at either end, something, it's some modernist idea of a public space, but it's got a hell of a lot of traffic coming through it. Erno Goldfinger, another exile, Hungarian, studied under Auguste Perret in Paris. This fantastic block, Alexander Fleming House, on the eastern side of the Elephant and Castle. The Faraday Memorial, a kind of monument to the scientist with his discoveries in the field of electricity, which also happens to house the Bakerloo line transformers. This strange, I mean, this, you can see this sort of modernist indeterminate structure, this sort of pinwheel T-beams before us and before Paul. Quick sketch of how of its evolution, this Piccadilly Circus of the South, the kind of medieval crossroads. This sort of big roundabout with these sort of blocks. But with this sort of generosity, this sort of sense of the generous and this sort of progressive ambition. So what we've proposed, this is the movement, is as the road, and this is a sort of road scheme at one level, but that we reclaim this large area of public realm of pavement. Public realm is what we have to try and make it. It becomes a peninsula. The traffic comes around it. The the underground stations actually come up and meet it. We build then this, and we try and relate both this. This is a sort of relic of the Victorian era. This is then the modernist relic. This is the Haygate estate that's being ripped down with, 79 social homes provided. There's a lot of, Stephen spent months in negotiations, sort of being, I suppose, spineless in public and feisty in private. Although I don't know, I'm sure he's never entirely spineless. But going along with everyone's, absorbing all these interests, and actually, part of what we do is, defer decisions as long as possible in terms of design. That's like the sort of the castle. But one of the keys we find to kind of working in public is actually show as little as possible at the early stages, wait till everyone else shows their hands, and then you can negotiate. You can't without putting your feet in it. So this is then, after all this sort of spinelessness and absorbing everyone's ambitions and pressures and whatever, we then finally came up with this ambition and pushed back, became feisty. This idea that you'd use you'd relate to then, this is Alexander Fleming House. This is then the London College of Communication, a university. On the edge of it. The South Bank University is also here. The shopping centre, which will be demolished anyway, should be formed to actually be a part of this public space. We called it a 21st century London Square, so we're learning the kind of the bullshit that you need to kind of sell this stuff. But it's a square. Russell Square is one of the kind of really vivid London squares, with the university at its edge, the Brunswick shopping centre at another edge, Cafe Pavilion in the middle. It is possible, and lots of bloody traffic pouring through, so it's possible. It's possible. The idea that then we'd keep the Faraday Monument. Stephen went to a meeting where they spent the first half hour saying, that thing's in the way. I don't like it. I've never liked it. Let's get rid of it. It's £18 million to replumb the, electricity for the Bakerloo line. I don't like it. Let's get rid of it. And he said, well, actually, we've got a scheme where we think you could keep it. So this idea that you keep these remnants of kind of futures past and add to them with new pavilions as part of a landscape of small pavilions defined in this larger kind of block of the New London Square. And this is the image that the Transport for London team called London's Burning, which was our attempt to kind of do the kind of CGI sort of hard sell, but which sketches out this idea of, I suppose it's an idea of a public space that's kind of part inherited, part projected, where you can't tell the difference between what's always been there and what has just been added, where there isn't some grand, big narrative about what the public is. There are kind of collections, there are corners, we accept this sort of fragmentation of the public in a fragmented public realm. So, yes, we've tried taking the kind of this sort of full contact with inherited structures on the road, and it's met with a mixed success. But you'd have heard all the talk of the Grexit, the Greek exit from the euro. There's obviously much talk of Brexit, Britain's exit from the whole European Union. We'd have killed to have won any of those competitions, but we are actually delighted to stay in London and fight our corner, fighting for this idea of, if you like, continuity and transformation rather than creative destruction, and find, even in London, a kind of echo of the European city. Thank you very much.